Good morning, Professor, and my peers of BUSN 6030 International Business Course. The topic of today's presentation is on the model of balance of payments crisis. It is pertaining to the macroeconomic level policy and money-making part of a global business outlook. The presentation is prepared, compiled, and presented by Team 6 that includes Karampreet Kaur, Rhoda Aziz, and I, Balraj Kathuria. To begin with, there are many ways the government can peg or fix the exchange rate, starting with open market operations, intervention in the forward exchange markets, and direct operations in foreign assets to defend an exchange parity. Certain instruments, such as changes in the bank reserve requirements, can also be considered as an additional way of pegging the exchange rate by the government. If the government attempts to prevent its currency from depreciating, it will result in exhaustion of their foreign reserves and may see its borrowing reach the limit as well. On the other hand, if it prevents its currency from appreciating, it may find the domestic inflation cost unacceptable, and when the government is no longer able to defend a fixed parity because of the constraints on its actions, there occurs a crisis in balance of payments. Further in this presentation will be an analysis and a model developed to ascertain how to deal with such crisis. A standard crisis could occur when a country has a pegged exchange rate through foreign exchange markets, and before they exhaust their foreign reserves, there is a sudden speculative attack that eliminates the last of the reserves quickly. Then the government is left with no way to control the exchange rate, hence leading to the said crisis. Time and again we might question that the events of such a dramatic and intense level can be captured by a model or no. Yes, the attacks can be forecasted, they can be seen as a change in the portfolio composition of the investors, thereby reducing the proportions of domestic currency and increasing that of foreign currency. The change in composition is then justified by a change in relative yields for when the government is no longer able to defend the exchange rate of the currency begins depreciating. To study the balance of payments crisis, we must know that the model being developed here have two characteristics. First, the demand for domestic currency depends upon the exchange rate. Second, the exchange rate that clears the domestic money market changes over time. We are assuming the model is bases a small country producing a single composite trading good. The prices of the good will be set based on world markets in order to hold the purchasing power parity. This can be interpreted as the equation P is equal to S multiplied by P star, where P is the domestic price level, S is the exchange rate of the currency, and P star is the foreign price level. Therefore, we can identify the exchange rate with the price level owing to this equation. In this model, the economy is assumed to have fully flexible prices and wages, assuring that output is always at its full employment level. The balance of trade, which also turns out to in the model to be the balance of payments on current account, will be determined by the difference between output and spending. Once we have managed to determine that, we move to the investors whose only assumed choices are domestic or foreign money. Both currencies bear a zero nominal interest rate. The total real wealth of domestic residents is the sum of the real value of their holdings of domestic money M and their holdings of foreign money F. As a final simplifying assumption, we suppose that foreigners do not hold domestic money. Then M is also the outstanding stock of domestic money, and in equilibrium domestic residents must be willing to hold that stock. Since we assume the desired holdings of domestic money are proportional to wealth, the condition for portfolio equilibrium will be M is equal to L bracket pi multiplied by W. Here pi stands for the rate of inflation. In this model, it is also the expected rate of depreciation of the currency. For the current study, we will treat pi as exogenous. We will have two exchange rate regimes that will be considered in this analysis. First will be freely floating exchange rate with the government abstaining from either buying or selling foreign money. Second will be the fixed exchange rate. In this scenario, the government holds a reserve of foreign money and stands ready to exchange foreign for domestic money at a fixed price.
Dynamic behavior with a flexible exchange rate. This explains how flexible exchange rate regime causes balance of payment crisis in an economy. To better appreciate this concept, we need to first understand the meaning of flexible exchange rate regime. By definition, a flexible exchange rate policy is one that permits the exchange rate to be determined by demand and supply with no direct intervention in the foreign exchange market by the central bank or the government. This means that the forces of demand and supply determines the foreign exchange rate at every point in time. Hence, the government or central bank has no control on the foreign exchange rate. Under a flexible exchange rate regime, the central bank does not sell any reserves. Hence, the main assumption is that government deficit is financed by creating or printing money. Flexible exchange rate is affected by changes in three main factors, which are 1. The quantity of domestic money. This is determined by government spending. If the government has a deficit budget, then more money will be created and the quantity of money will increase. 2. Private holdings of foreign money or assets. This is determined by the claims of private investors on the rest of the world due to exchange of goods across borders. Hence, rate of accumulation of foreign money must equal the current account balance. Also, domestic residents will only be willing to increase the proportion of domestic money in their portfolio if they are offered a higher yield in the form of reduced inflation. This will be further explained in the next section. 3. Expected inflation rate. This is determined by speculators and highly subjective. This chart explains how a flexible exchange rate regime is altered to result to a balance of payment crisis. Here, the economy is assumed to always be on the stable arm, represented by the line connecting SABS. Horizontal axis F represents holdings of foreign money. The vertical axis M represents real domestic money supply. If the initial holdings of foreign money is FO, the price level will adjust, making the real domestic money supply as MO, with the initial position of the economy being at point B. As less investment is made in foreign money and more domestic money is created to finance deficit budget, the system converges gradually to point A. At some point in time, this will lead to a balance of payment crisis. Now, looking at the flip side, how does the fixed exchange rate regime lead to a balance of payment crisis? A fixed exchange rate policy is one that pegs the exchange rate at a value decided by the government or central bank. This is achieved by a direct intervention in the foreign exchange market to block unregulated forces of demand and supply. It entails that the central bank stands ready to buy and sell foreign currency in exchange for domestic currency at the pre-announced exchange rate. It also requires that the central bank always have adequate foreign reserves to defend the announced fixed exchange rate regime. The main assumption for this model is that the government has a budget deficit that is financed either by issuing new domestic money or by drawing on its foreign exchange reserves. Consequently, a fixed exchange rate regime will stay in place as long as foreign exchange reserves with the central bank are positive. To better appreciate this concept, we need to examine the budget constraints of the private sector and the government. The private sector can acquire assets only by spending less than its income. That is, they have more savings to invest. In allocating their savings between domestic and foreign money holdings, private sector will consider the yield on investment in domestic currency. As long as investors believe that the government will continue to peg the price level, there will be a stable relationship between wealth and money holdings. This is because price level is fixed, leading to a higher yield on investment in domestic currency. As long as the government is committed to pegging the exchange rate, it has no control over how its deficit is financed. If the government issues more domestic money than the private sector is willing to hold, private investors can always withdraw the excess money from circulation by trading it for foreign money at the exchange market. As a result, the extent to which the government finances its deficit by running down its foreign currency reserves is actually determined by the private sector's willingness to acquire additional domestic money. Over time, both private wealth and government reserves will change. When the government runs a deficit, it will lose reserves, even if private savings is zero. Pegging the rate ultimately becomes impossible if the budget is in deficit, no matter how large the initial reserves. When it is not possible to peg the exchange rate forever, the pegging effort will at some point collapse in a sudden balance of payment crisis. This chart shows how the fixed exchange rate regime results in a balance of payment crisis. Wealth and reserves are fixed at the initial state. However, as government continues to peg exchange rate, yield will continue to rise and private sector will continue to invest in domestic currency, thereby leading to the creation of more money in circulation. At a point, the government will no longer be able to defend the fixed exchange rate irrespective of the amount of the initial reserves. Thus, in an environment with frictionless capital flows across borders, trying to expand money supply to support a fiscal deficit causes the fixed exchange rate regime to become unsustainable and ends eventually in a currency crisis.
Hi everyone, my name is Karampreet Kaur and I am going to explain section 4 and 5 of this case study. So first we all need to know about the foreign reserves. What do you mean by foreign reserves? Foreign exchange reserves are cash and any other reserve assets such as gold which is held by the central bank or other monetary authority that are primarily available to the balance of payments of the country and influence the foreign exchange rate of its currency. And these foreign exchange reserves are there to maintain the confidence in the financial market. So what is the situation with the foreign reserves and capital loss? There are two situations when the government is having the foreign reserves and the other one is the vice versa when the government is not having. So when the government is having the foreign reserves, the domestic money supply will be determined by the portfolio preference of domestic residents. In the case when the reserves are exhausted, then the portfolio balance determines the price level instead of the money supply. Now when the government is not having the foreign reserves and it determines the price level. So what would happen to the price level? The price level begins rising and along with the price level, the level of currency depreciation begins also increasing. When the rate of currency depreciation increasing, the demand of domestic money falls. And when the demand of domestic money falls, then again there will be the capital loss and the prices will be increased. But what are the reasons behind the level of the prices increasing? There are two reasons which explain that why the level of the prices increases when the foreign reserves are exhausted. So the first reason is the domestic residents may still be deceiving and try to reduce their holdings of both the domestic and the foreign money. And the second reason may be that if the government is running a deficit budget, then the nominal money supply would be rising in the country and the prices will be rise. So when the government is out of the reserves, then the pegging ends, means the fixed exchange rate ends. and the exchange rate is allowed to float, and there would be the huge capital losses to the investors. So the first argument which we have just made is depend on the assumption that when reserves run out of the economy's position, so the economy just move from the expansion path to the stable path. Otherwise, the exchange rate would fall instead of rising when the reserves run out. But it is easily we can see that the moment of exhaustion of reserves, at the moment of the exhaustion of reserves, private wealth must be large enough to put the economy in the assumed position. So what if there is no speculation against the currency? The exhaustion of the reserves will always produce a discrete jump in the price level, and that will be cause of windfall capital loss. But we know the investors cannot have expected such a capital loss to happen because they would have avoided it. In particularly that situation, by exchanging the domestic money for foreign money is in an instant because reserves are exhausted, a speculator could earn infinite rate of return. If everyone try to do this, then the government reserves would be eliminated, and the prospect of this could cause speculators to attempt to get out of the domestic money and so on. But we have to consider what such a speculative attack involves. So if we see from the government point of view, it involves the liquidation of its reserves, and on the other hand, domestic residents represent it as the change in the composition of their portfolio. So when the speculative attack takes place, after that the economy will be having the flexible rate regime and the post-crisis prices, which will be determined from the asset holdings, and there is a certain balance of payment crisis occurs. And all these things will just eliminate the remaining reserves and forces the transitions to the floating exchange rate. So this is the figure with which we can understand about the speculative attack and the speculative attacks effect on the economy and the private holdings. So in this diagram, the OX path is the path which represents the before the speculative attack, and before the speculative attack on O-axis, the economy is on the fixed rate. So when the speculative attack takes place, the economy is shifted to SS. On the SS, the economy is on the flexible rate with the speculative attack. And suppose that this moment of attack, what would happen to the private holdings? So before the speculative attack, the private holdings are represented by point A. So in the meantime of the attack, investors relocate their funds, and they will reduce their holdings of both domestic and foreign, and they shifted from point A to point B along with the line of the constant W. And the increase in the holdings of the foreign money is achieved by the acquired government reserves, that is represented by R. So as we can see with the speculative attack, not only the rate of exchange shifted from fixed to flexible, even the holdings of the private also decreased. So when the government policies are certain, then an economy with a balance of payment problem will pass through the three stages. So in the first stage, a period of gradually declining the reserves. In this stage, the reserves are starting to declining. The government foreign reserves are starting to declining in the first stage, and it would affect on the investors, like how they reacted about the declining of the foreign reserves of the government, about their actions. So in the second stage is the speculative attack, when the governments are exhausted out of their reserves, and because of that there will be increase in the price level, increase in the rate of currency depreciation, and the increase in the nominal supply of the money, And because of the speculative attack in the second stage, the investors' holdings for both the private and the foreign money will be also decreased, which is already explained in the figure as in the previous slide. So the third stage is the post-crisis period. So in this stage, it is the period during which the currency is gradually started depreciating. But what would happen if the government policies are uncertain? In this case study, there is only one source of uncertainty explained by the author, that is the incomplete knowledge of the investors. What incomplete knowledge? The incomplete knowledge of the investors about how much of its reserves the government is willing to use to defend the exchange rate. So the government is having the two reserves, primary reserve and the secondary reserve. The primary reserve is represented by a R1 and the secondary reserve is represented by R2. So I'm going to use R1 and R2 thing only in the further explanation. So what is R1? R1 is include a bank's vault cash and the checkable deposits which is held with the other banks or any other funds that are accessible immediately to meet the demands for liquidity made against the bank. And the R2 is defined as the consist of the assets paying some interest, but their principal feature is ready for the marketability. So the investors know that the government will use the primary reserve to defend the exchange rate. But the investors are not sure about the R2. They may think the government may or may not use it. Now, if speculative attack takes place and investors acquire whole of the government remaining reserves R1, if the government then commits its secondary reserve R2 to maintain the value of the currency, investors then reverse themselves and exchange foreign money for domestic, and it would produce a recovery of the government reserves. On the other hand, if there was no speculative attack or the attack was not enough completely eliminated the R1 and then the government decided not to use the R2, then the R1 was exhausted. There would be a discrete jump in the exchange rate, a capital loss will occur. So there must be the speculative attack, hence so that we can use the R2. So the R2 can be used by the government and the risk of the capital loss has been eliminated and the holdings of the domestic money would be back to the previous level.
To summarize and conclude, we see that the analysis is on a balance of payments crisis situation in a country that is losing gradual reserves and in which there is a speculative attack on the currency. Multiple attacks to be precise. We see the crises are natural outcomes of the investors' search maximizing behavior. Additionally, when the government's willingness to use reserves to defend the exchange rate is uncertain, there can be a series of crises in which the capital flows out of the country, then returns before the issue is corrected for good. This analysis is also subject to two major limitations. The first is that it is based on a highly simplified macroeconomic model. This makes it easier to develop the main points of the argument, but means that the analysis of the factors triggering a balance of payments crisis is surely incomplete. The second limitation is that the assumption that only two assets are available places an unrealistic constraint on the possible actions of the government, because the only way then it can peg exchange rate is by selling its reserves. Thus, in a more realistic model, there could be a possibility of other policies to stabilize the exchange rate, such as an open market sales of securities or intervention in the forward market. Despite these limitations, the said analysis is suggestive and does help explain why efforts to defend fixed exchange rates so often lead to crises.